Okay, we're going to talk about speciation now. And speciation is particularly the formation of new species from pre-existing ones. So these are not species that are, I don't know, magically appearing from nowhere. You have to have something to start with, chicken and egg thing. And I think this is probably a good place to remind you what a species is. So these are a group of similar organisms that can interbreed to form, and this is key, fertile offspring. And we'll go into what might prevent fertility during the course of this video, I think, probably. So I realised that I managed to do an entire video on evolution without mentioning this key term, natural selection, which is, I think that's an achievement. So, the top of this diagram, which you've all seen if you've done the little activity that goes with it, Darwin wrote, because he was Victorian and they wrote in lots of big convoluted twaddle, really, a bit like Shakespeare. We may feel sure that any variation in the least degree injurious will be rigidly destroyed. So these are the organisms that are dying because they are less fit. This preservation of favourable variations, so these are what we now call the ones with a selective advantage, and the rejection of injurious variations, they're the ones dying because they're not well adapted, I call natural selection. So that whole process, starting off with overproduction of offspring, ones with favourable alleles surviving, reproducing and passing those on, that whole process is natural selection, and that's really key. That is how, that's the mechanism by which those organisms change. So, formation of new species, obviously we could be looking at starting off with one species and getting these variations and things that are best adapted and going through. Now what the problem with that is that you can rarely try and breed your end product, so if you looked at human evolution, for example, Homo sapiens, we can't go back and see, could we breed with Homo australopithecus, because they're not there anymore, they've died, that's the point. But in some cases we can actually do this. So we're going to look at two ways in which you might get species forming sort of alongside each other. So you really here we're talking about sort of having one species and then them diverging into two. It might be that original species just stays the same and this one becomes different, but they're both extant at the same time. So that's what the evidence for this is. It's all based on sort of extant living organisms. So we've got two sorts of ways of any speciation is going to have to start off with some kind of isolation, something that is preventing that gene pool remaining intact. I'm just folding over Darwin because his Victorian language annoys me. Don't read The Origin of Species, it's clearly the most boring book in the universe. It's all in language like that. No, it's not as boring as Ulysses. Don't read that. I don't think anybody's ever read that. So, we've got to separate our organisms initially and prevent them interbreeding so that the differences can build up between each other. So we're saying that, at the end, these are going to be very different from these. How is that going to happen? Well, you've got to stop them interbreeding, because otherwise you're just going to get a load of hybrids. So, two ways in which that can happen. So we'll start with allopatric. Allopatric, I think, is the easiest to understand. So we start off with a large population, initial large population, where they're all interbreeding and their gene pools are all mixed and they're all one species. Great. And this has happened a number of times. You might get a ice cap forming, or a river erodes through so far that it causes a deep chasm. The Grand Canyon's a prime example of that. You might get water levels falling and rising, like in lakes, which might separate some of the lake out into smaller areas. It might be that you've got an island and you get an organism, like the Galapagos, tortoises being washed over on debris to the Galapagos Islands, and therefore being separated by a huge body of sea from the ones on the mainland. So this is the easiest one to understand, I think. So our populations get separated by whatever geographical barrier it is. So allopatric always means something big and geography-ish in the way. It could be a mountain range, depending on size of organism. A river might be enough for something little that can't swim. A canyon, an ice cap, big chunk of sea. If the conditions, so the environment in those two separated surrounding those two separated populations are different, or the selection pressures are different, then different selective advantages will operate. So, for example, if on one island you've got a great big chunky predator, it might be more favourable to hang around in a group. So this might apply to something like the orangutans on Borneo and Sumatra. So Borneo, no tigers. Sumatra, tigers. Sumatran gorillas, orangutans, hang around in a group for protection. So the males are all quite solitary because they're quite big and quite capable of taking on a tiger, but the ones with very vulnerable youngsters and the females that have just given birth to them, they tend to hang around in groups, whereas on Borneo, no predator, they don't. And so it can be a behavioural thing, it can be a physical thing. If it's sunnier on one side than the other, you might get more protection from having darker fur or darker skin. And this will, so the selection pressure, the thing that is causing the death, is going to be different on both sides of this. So we then get natural selection. So the best fitted in that particular environment, which is different from this one, will cause the changes in allele frequency, which will affect the phenotypes. And so if you then remove that geographical barrier, so at a later date, we take, a gorilla, orangutan, I don't know why I could call them gorillas, orangutan from Borneo and Sumatra, and stick them in a zoo so that they're together, then it may be that they are no longer interbreed, or they can't interbreed successfully to produce fertile offspring. And then we say, oh, they're different species. Okay, so they're really clearly different. So allopatric, really easy, I think, to understand. Sympatric speciation is a little bit trickier, not because it's any different, but because it's in the same geographical area. So you're kind of left with the conundrum of, well, if you've got one population and they're in one area, why on earth would they choose to not have random mating? Why would the gene pool not stay the same? So the key thing is that you've got differences between individuals. And if we sort of imagine when we did Clippy Island, those birds with the beaks, their little clippy beaks, if you have a big beaked bird, it's going to find it much easier to get nutrition from bigger, harder seeds, and a little sharp beaked bird will favour the smaller, softer seeds. Now that might mean that the bigger beaked birds naturally tend to congregate at the bottom of bushes that produce bigger seeds, whereas the little sharp-beaked birds might find it much easier to gain their nutrition if they're sort of, hovering around in the grass. And it kind of then becomes like a sort of a clique, and they don't want to associate. It's, you wouldn't, as an animal, an organism, you wouldn't go miles just to interbreed. You don't go miles to reproduce. Some of them do, but you know, it's quite rare. You just, you know, have sex with whoever's nearest, effectively, even if it is your sister. I know, a bit grim. So the ones that are sort of, you know, hanging around by the big seed bush will just hang around there, and they'll have sex with, you know, and reproduce with the organisms that are there. And the ones in the grass will just tend to kind of reproduce with the ones that are in the grass with the smaller, sharper beaks. So then gradually you get those differences building up again. So the ones that are getting the most food are going to survive, and these little sharper beaks will get smaller and sharper, and the big beaks will get bigger and bigger, until additional differences build up through mutations, and eventually they will no longer be able to interbreed. Now generally, with sympatric speciation, we're talking about differences in things like courtship behaviour. You're talking about, you know, very slight differences. They may also differ phenotypically, but you're talking about courtship behaviour and failure to reproduce, and eventually they'll get things like slight seasonal differences. Perhaps, you know, one group of birds might only have sex on a Wednesday and the other group might have it on a Thursday, so the Wednesday lot are never ever going to have sex with the Thursday lot. It's that kind of thing. It tends to be seasonal rather than Wednesdays and Thursdays, but you know, you get the picture. Eventually those differences will build up and build up until things like insects will be mechanically isolated. That means their genitalia don't fit together. You might get the gametes will fail to fertilise. That might be particularly relevant to things like marine invertebrates. You might get hybrid inviability, where if there are hybrids then they tend to not survive and not be as fit as everything else. And moving further, so as they get more and more different, you're going to get things like hybrid sterility. So you get the hybrid organism, but it's not fertile, and that can be down to chromosome pairing and chromosome number. In allopatric speciation, of course, you're still going to get those things. You know, you might get different behaviours and mechanical isolation and gametic isolation and hybrid inviability and hybrid sterility, certainly, as an end product. And in the middle, you've got the natural selection. So you've got the separation so that you're not getting gene flow between your populations, and then you're going to get natural selection, and then you're going to get, right, we can no longer interbreed to form fertile offspring.